Hit subscribe now, because the next episode goes even deeper than this one. Two people can be born in the same valley, drink from the same river their whole lives, and be buried eventually in the same red soil. And their DNA can differ from each other more than a stranger from Norway differs from a stranger from Japan. That is not a hypothetical. It is a measured, repeated finding sitting quietly in genome databases most people will never open. Biology has a rule about what should happen when a species spreads across a landmass. Variation should smooth out, blend, average toward the middle over time. That rule breaks down completely on one continent. The gap is not a rounding error. It is a canyon cut straight through the human genome, and for most of the 20th century, almost no one was measuring it. For generations, the story taught in classrooms and museum placards was clean. And it was not wrong, exactly, just incomplete. Modern humans arose in Africa, the story goes, sometime in the last 200 to 300,000 years. A relatively small group left the continent roughly 60,000 years ago, crossed into the Arabian Peninsula, and from that single migration, every population outside Africa descends. Europeans, East Asians, Pacific Islanders, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, all of it. One long branching tree from one narrow trunk. It is a satisfying story. It explains a great deal. It gives humanity a single point of departure, a shared point of origin, a tidy diagram with one arrow leaving one continent and spreading outward like ink in water. Most textbooks stop there, and for most purposes, that is where the story has always ended. There is a quiet assumption folded into that narrative, though, one almost nobody states out loud. If everyone outside Africa comes from one small departing group, then Africa itself gets treated, almost by accident, as the calm point of origin. One ancestral population, waiting, before the real drama of human migration began. That assumption turns out to be almost exactly backward. Here is where it gets complicated. In 2009, a research team led by geneticist Sarah Tishkoff at the University of Pennsylvania published the largest study of African genetic variation ever conducted, sampling more than 100 populations across the continent. The finding that made headlines was this. The average African genome carries nearly 1 million more genetic variants than the average genome from anywhere else on Earth. Not a few thousand, not a rounding difference, close to 1 million. To put that in plain terms, if a genome is like a long, detailed manuscript copied and recopied across thousands of generations, with small scribal errors creeping in each time, then the African manuscript has simply been copied longer, by more scribes, in more separate rooms, than any other version of the text in existence. But the deeper anomaly wasn't just the size of the number. It was where the deepest split in the entire human family tree turned out to sit. In 2017, a separate team led by Karina Schlibush sequenced ancient genomes from southern Africa and dated the earliest known divergence between human populations to somewhere between 350,000 and 260,000 years ago. A split involving the ancestors of the Khoe San peoples of southern Africa. Not a split between Africans and non-Africans, a split inside Africa, between Africans and other Africans, older than the migration that supposedly started everything. Clean story, cracked open. The first theory is the one most researchers reach for first, and it is not wrong, time depth. Modern humans have simply lived in Africa longer than anywhere else on the planet, tens of thousands of years longer than any population outside it has existed at all. A haplogroup, if it helps to picture it, functions something like a surname passed down not on paper, but inside the body itself, inherited along a single line, generation after generation, largely unchanged except for the occasional new nickname picked up along the way. The longer a lineage exists, the more of those small nicknames accumulate. Researchers are careful to frame this as a strong contributing factor, not a full explanation. The data supports it, but it doesn't close the case. Because time alone doesn't explain why that diversity is so unevenly distributed, even within the continent itself. The Khoe San, for instance, are dramatically more genetically divergent than neighboring populations living just a few hundred kilometers away. Populations who have had access to exactly the same stretch of deep time. Time explains the depth, it does not explain the unevenness. This is the part the models don't fully explain on their own, which brings in the second theory. More mathematical, more mechanical, and just as real. As small groups broke off from larger populations and moved outward across the landscape, each departing group carried only a fraction of the genetic variation that existed in the population they left behind. Geneticists call this a serial founder effect, and it behaves something like pouring a full jar of mixed marbles into a series of smaller cups. Each cup downstream gets fewer colors than the one before it, not because marbles vanish, but because no single scoop can carry the full variety forward. Researchers, including Ramachandran and Prugnoli, formally modeled this pattern in 2005, showing that genetic diversity decreases in near-linear fashion the farther a population's ancestors traveled from East and Southern Africa. It is an elegant explanation for the gradient. It is not, however, an explanation for the outliers. It doesn't explain why certain African populations, again, the Khoe San chief among them, remained isolated enough, for long enough, to preserve a divergence measured not in thousands of years, but in hundreds of thousands. Founder effects explain the slope. They don't explain the peak sitting apart from it. The third theory is the one most researchers are still hesitant to state plainly, because it unsettles something deeper than a diagram. It unsettles the idea of a single origin at all. A growing body of evidence suggests that early Homo sapiens may not have descended from one unified ancestral population in one place, but from several semi-isolated groups scattered across the African continent. Groups that periodically split, drifted apart for tens of thousands of years, then reconnected and mixed again, long before anyone left for anywhere else. The Khoe San genome itself carries a strange layered signature of this. Alongside its nearly quarter-million-year-old core divergence, researchers have found evidence of more recent admixture, genetic contributions from outside groups making up upward of 9 to 10% of the modern Khoe San genome, mixed in long after that original, ancient split. The data doesn't confirm multiple origins outright. It only fails to rule them out. And that unresolved gap, not an error, not a gap in the data collection, but a genuine, standing question in the field, is still being argued over in journals today. Picture the Kalahari at the edge of evening, the heat of the day just beginning to let go of the sand, the sky turning the color of a bruise healing. A fire is lit the way it has been lit for longer than anyone can responsibly estimate. Around it, a language moves through the air, built partly from consonants formed by a click of the tongue against the roof of the mouth. Sounds linguists still struggle to classify against any other language family on Earth. The people speaking it are not relics. They are not a frozen snapshot of the past, despite how they were described for over a century by outsiders who assumed isolation meant stagnation. They are a living, continuous, still adapting lineage carrying, inside every cell, a genetic thread longer than any other traceable line of descent in the human species. Not a fossil, not a footnote, a through line. And here the story stops being simple. For over 100 years, the Khoe San were described, in colonial ethnographies, in early anthropology, even in well-meaning documentaries, as an isolated, unchanged people, a kind of living fossil left behind, while the rest of humanity moved forward. The genetic record says the opposite. This is not a population that stayed still while history happened elsewhere. This is the site of the single most dynamic, deepest branching chapter of human genetic history that has ever been measured. The irony sits almost too neatly. The population once framed as the outsiders of human progress turns out to be the trunk, not a forgotten branch. And everyone else, every population in Europe, Asia, the Americas, the Pacific, descends from one narrow subset of the diversity that already existed on that continent before anyone left it. A South African population geneticist reviewing these findings once put it simply to a colleague, in words that have stuck with researchers since. The rest of the world isn't where humanity spread out from, it's where humanity narrowed down to. Everyone outside Africa is, genetically speaking, the edited version. The full manuscript never left, which reframes the entire question of what human variation is even supposed to mean. The categories most casually used to describe human difference, continental, racial, regional, were built on the assumption that the biggest genetic gaps run between continents. They don't. The deepest gap in the recorded human genome runs inside one continent, between two African populations, both older than the migration that populated everywhere else combined. And there's a second, quieter problem sitting underneath all of it. Most large-scale genome studies, even now, still radically underrepresent African populations, meaning the people holding the most human genetic diversity on the planet remain among the least studied by the very science built to understand them. The manuscript with the most pages, the deepest revisions, the oldest handwriting, is also the one still sitting mostly unread, which is why, when you ask what actually makes us human, the answer keeps leading back to the same continent, holding more diversity than the rest of the world combined, and why the map of that diversity is still, even today, only half drawn.